This is Britain's colonial empire, from the Antarctic to the tropics, with dependencies in every continent and every ocean.
So what we think of as the collapse of the British Empire took place more or less around the middle decades of the 20th century, and we normally mark this from the end of the Second World War in 1945 up until, let's say, the mid to late 60s, although there were in fact decolonisation moments happening after that. Now, from 1945 to that period, sort of mid-late 60s, what you saw was the formal political legal independence of countries in Asia and Africa, particularly South Asia, beginning with India, and going through Africa, starting with Ghana in 1957 and moving on through from there. So why did empire collapse? There are many competing explanations, but we can group these broadly into thinking about what's happening inside Britain and what's happening outside Britain. Inside Britain, of course, at the end of the Second World War, the country was pretty devastated in a material sense, and people were keen to focus efforts and energies on rebuilding the country. There was more a sense that the national economy needed to be rebuilt, and so the imperial trading arrangements, the preferences that had gone before, began to become less important. The other idea that circulates about the end of empire within Britain was the sense that the time was changing, that the period of its imperial rule was coming to an end, and it chose to withdraw from those colonies. Now, these explanations are very contested, and that's particularly done by looking at factors from outside Britain. So this would emphasise the role of resistance against empire in a political and a military sense across the world. Now, if you think about India, you had a lot of mass movements there that tried to render the country ungovernable. If you look at places like Kenya, there were insurgencies against the colonial government. So you had resistance. You also had the Cold War, which meant that the West was particularly keen to make sure that countries didn't go communist, and therefore attempted to manage the process so that they wouldn't become more aligned with the Soviet Union. Beyond this, you had ideological shifts at the level of the United Nations, where the questions of racial equality and decolonisation were becoming pressed by newer and newer members who became more and more numerous. So in 1960, the UN passed its declaration on decolonisation, setting the agenda for rapid decolonisations thereafter. Why do we need to talk about empire today? Well, first, there's a strong sense in which many structures from empire, such as the hierarchies in the world economy, the differential treatment of people with different racial backgrounds, and also the ways in which political institutions work, continue to have this kind of hierarchical structure that they inherited from empire. So those are issues and areas in which people want to probe whether we've really decolonised. There's a tension fundamentally between the hierarchical structure of an empire and what we think of as a more equal democratic structure in the world, as enshrined in things like the right to self-determination and racial equality and so on. Now, those things are in tension, and what we're negotiating at the moment is how the hierarchies that were produced in one age impact on and shape this idea of equality that we have now. So why are statues contentious? On the one hand, probably most of us walk past statues all the time, and especially when we walk past them every day, we don't even notice them. Yet they're part of the everyday fabric of our lives, and part of the symbolic order in which we celebrate public figures. Now, as we've begun to reappraise empire and begun to reappraise what values we think public space should celebrate, it's right that we should think about what statues there are and what they celebrate and what they represent. Now, this is particularly important because Britain is not, if it ever was, that fantasy of a single national entity. It's always been transnational in some sense. If you think about Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and transnational in a more fundamental sense if you think about its Atlantic spread and its empire. So thinking about Britain as a kind of transnational entity, a country which has all these connections, how do different parts of that entity relate to the ways in which it represents its past and what it celebrates about its past? So the debate about statues is about who gets to belong, who gets to matter, what kinds of violence we're comfortable with and not comfortable with, and what we choose to uphold going forward. It's not unusual in the wake of reassessing historical periods for memorials and other kinds of things to be reevaluated. If we look at what happened in Germany after the Second World War, certainly there was a massive reevaluation of how the public space understood fascism and understood German imperialism. So when we talk about decolonisation now, in relation to the curriculum or public space, what we're really thinking about is how to firstly have a sort of critical awareness of colonialism and empire and how these things shaped the way we think about the world. And second, to think about whether there are alternative perspectives or points of departure which we can use to articulate our meanings and our interpretations. So let's think of an example. In history and in fields of social science, we're taught to think about countries as being ahead or behind each other. We think of a country as being advanced and other countries as catching up. And this is a language which actually just updates the idea of civilized and backward countries, right? And so these ideas are pretty pervasive. Let's think about the idea of international development or national development. But when we understand that these were forged with certain assumptions about what societies should look like and which societies were good and which were not so good, then we start to challenge whether we should even be comparing countries and societies in that way. And it's through a critical reappraisal of some of these ideas that we can actually make progress in how we think about things.